thank you for those of you who made it back more or less on time, and I'm sure the others will filter in unless they've been scared away. So here we just jump straight into some results. This work's been occurring over a number of years. A lot of the stuff that was completed earlier has already been published for some time. A handful of you in the room have seen this before, but many of you haven't. But if you're interested, that's the name of the paper that's got a lot of details on how this was all done that I haven't had time to go into. So we're going to frame these results in terms of questions that might be of interest. A question that's clearly of interest to a lot of people are how does TNR using traditional surgery compare to what animal control departments have been doing for decades, which is removing cats from the landscape, particularly when there are complaints, and typically euthanizing them. Now, you could make this comparison a whole bunch of different ways, but we decided to do it this particular way. We decided to pick an intermediate level of outcome where after 10 years, back one for me, please. Where after 10 years, we've gone from this number of cats down to about half as many. And we chose to look at what it would take to get to that point using a TNR approach versus a removal approach. What it turns out is that to get there using a TNR approach, you have to sterilize about 75% of your target cats every 6-month time step. We could translate that into doing trapping every month or every year, however you structured it, but that's just the time step that we happen to choose. To get to that point by removing cats from the landscape, you would have to remove 25% of the ones who were there every time step. Now, it's worth keeping in mind, and we'll see that in just a second, 2 or 3 slides down, that 75 and 25 aren't absolute numbers, right? By the time you get toward the end of one of these TNR scenarios, you may have very few target cats left in your population. Most of them will be sterilized. So removing 75% of them might only be removing 1 or 2 for TNR and then putting them back. Whereas removing 25% of your target cats, who's anybody, might be doing 8 or 10. So 25 and 75 are proportions. They're not absolute numbers. So don't let that fool you. So we can get to that midpoint either of 2 ways, but economically speaking and in terms of effort, how do they compare, which is the question of interest. Now, as I was just telling somebody before, the absolute dollar amounts you shouldn't pay too much attention to, but I think the comparisons here probably mean something. To get to those 2 points that I just described by either of those 2 routes, it actually turns out to be considerably cheaper to do it under certain circumstances by doing surgical sterilization than by removing and euthanizing cats. It's even cheaper if you factor in the possibility that in a TNR style program, there's a good chance you can get some of that cost of trapping cats donated for free by volunteers. That's an actually pretty encouraging result for the people who support this kind of work, I think. Another way to look at the same thing is what I've called here cost per down tick. What does that mean? Well, as you remember in the previous graph, we're looking at 2 different ways to get from 50 cats to 25 cats. We're calling that 25 down ticks over 10 years. So per down tick, per reduction, what does it cost for each of those options? The differential actually between kind of a municipal control removal and a TNR style program is even a little bit more pronounced when you look at it this way. So that's a basic question that's of interest, and that's kind of a nice result. We talked a lot more about contraception the other day. It was of great interest to ACC&D to determine whether or not a temporary contraceptive might be a good substitute for surgery. I won't belabor that because I think most of you probably heard the talk yesterday when all the group was together. But suffice it to say that, not surprisingly, a temporary contraceptive is not as good in terms of just getting the number of cats down. And furthermore, the amount of effort you have to put into using a temporary contraceptive like Gonacon, which is an important caveat here, is considerable. You have to go out and recontracept every single cat every single year and do all of them. And if you do anything less than that, you get a less good result. And furthermore, you end up paying more overall, and you end up paying more per down tick. That said, as we talked about yesterday, if we could just improve that temporary contraceptive in any of several respects, that conclusion might change. This is what we call in the modeling world a sensitivity analysis. Remember, there are a lot of numbers, there are a lot of estimated parameters, we call them, that go into one of these models. The death rate, the birth rate, the rate of immigration. Any of those numbers could be more or less accurate for the population in question. We could be wrong about some of them, or they could just vary considerably from one place to another. A sensitivity approach tells us how much our outcomes, or how much our answers, or how much our insights are going to change depending on how much one of those underlying parameters changes. So it might tell us, for instance, that if we're wrong about death rate, it has very little effect on our answers. But if we're wrong about birth rate, it's going to have a big effect on our answers. In this case, we were looking at how sensitive our outcomes are to tweaking the number of cats who show up in our population from the outside over time, whether by moving in on the ground or being dumped there by somebody. And what this is telling us is that with exactly the same amount of TNR effort in exactly the same way, if we compare the outcome we get when the immigration rate's 2% per time step versus 7% versus 12% is pretty profound. That's something that probably intuitively makes sense to practically everybody who's done this kind of work, but this is a quantitative way to illustrate just how important that factor is. What that means functionally is that if this rate's high enough, any effort we make to try and bring those numbers down by whatever method is pretty much swimming upstream. So it behooves us to try to understand the correlates of high immigration rates and either focus our efforts in places where we can make a difference or do something to get these numbers down in places where they're high as a correlate of doing the fertility control. Excuse me. And again, if we look at, this is again the costing information for those different immigration scenarios, you remember that at high immigration we were getting a worse outcome than at low immigration, and furthermore, we're paying more to get a worse outcome. So it has economic consequences as well. And if we standardize it in terms of downticks, we're getting a far worse bang for our buck when immigration rates are high. Here's another type of sensitivity analysis that we've called front-loading. Front-loading just means that there are different ways to distribute your effort. You could, for instance, if you've got money to do 1,000 surgeries, you could do 100 surgeries every month for 10 months. Or 10 surgeries every month for 100 months. Or you could do 900 surgeries if you had the surgical capacity in the first month or two, and then use the other 100 for sort of follow-up maintenance. The more that you concentrate your effort at the beginning, the more you have front-loading. The more you distribute your effort evenly across time, the less you have front-loading. So this shows us the outcomes that we get with the same overall effort over 10 years if we front-load it, if we concentrate it very heavily at the beginning to try and get that sterilization rate up very high versus if we spread it out over time. And again, this is a fairly profound difference. Again, just as many surgeries are being done over this time period, but depending on how we distribute them in time, we get pretty different population level outcomes. And furthermore, we get a better outcome by front-loading without spending any more money. And we get a better bang for our buck when we front load, or rather, when we front load, we get a better bang for our buck than when we don't front load for the same amount of overall effort. So this is part of the dynamics of the system. Lessons there, it pays to try to get your sterilization rate up high fast. A lot of people who do this work in the field know that, either by trial and error or by their own version of analysis or just by intuition. So this is a quantitative demonstration of that. We had some hope initially that by cleverly combining contraception and sterilization, or in certain ways, we could get better outcomes. Particularly, we thought that maybe if using that contraceptive was a little bit cheaper, we could use that at the beginning to get that sterilization rate up super high, super fast, and then go to sterilization when we had many cats contracepted. The difference is in doing these sorts of things, we're actually pretty modest between those two lines. There's a little bit of difference, but nothing to write home about. We also looked, just for the sake of argument, at what the benefits would be if, in addition to just sterilizing some fixed proportion of our cats and putting them back on the landscape, we routinely pulled 10% of those and tried to adopt them out so they were not on the landscape anymore. And we got some marginal improvement with that. And furthermore, the bottom line from all of this is, even though there are some subtle differences, combining contraception with a gonocon-like agent, which is what we thought we might have, is, for various reasons, not a particularly promising technology. But again, if we were to have a better contraceptive, that might all change. We know that adopting some cats out from the TNR stream is a good thing. It gets cats off the landscape faster and gets them into homes, but it does cost us more money to do that. Okay. There's only one reason to show you this, and that's not to read anything that's over in the right, but to look at the colors. Right? Just look at the colors and the key. Out of all those 466 particular combinations of management and situations and tools and parameters that we tested, we ranked them. And we ranked them in terms of, first we winnowed out all the ones that didn't reduce population by at least 40%. Right? So we've only got the ones that have some population level effect that's meaningful. And then we ranked them in terms of that cost to benefit ratio, how many dollars we spent per downtick. And when we did that, this is where, again, the message about temporary contraception gets a little bit more hopeful. When we did that, we saw, remembering back to the presentation yesterday, there's lots of different ways we can improve a temporary contraceptive over what gonocon looked like it was going to be. Most of the best options that we have in terms of cost benefit would occur if we were able to make one of those improvements in a significant way over what we currently have. Our basic options, which are just doing some version of TNR, in terms of cost effectiveness and outcome, some of them are up there, but they're not as high as these. There's also some potential benefit in, and as we heard from a previous speaker, in selectively targeting females, if that's a practical thing to do, because they do, after all, drive reproduction. And then our combination scenarios that I talked about that we were sort of hopeful for, at least as they're currently configured, weren't a big contributor to this top 50 list. So this is circling back from yesterday, that even though gonocon, as we understood it before, is sort of now off our radar screen as a cat fertility control tool, if something like that came along that made some of the improvements we talked about yesterday, it could easily ramp back up to being an important tool. So it's too early to write that area of technology off, I think. Okay. There are some take-home messages from all of this, I think, that are summarized here. That is that if we do TNR and we front load, like we've talked about, or target appropriately, as it's phrased in other venues, it compares quite favorably with the way that municipal animal control operations have typically tried to manage cats, and it can be effective. But that intensity of effort, that proper targeting of effort is really critical. As we'll see in just a minute, just doing it at any old rate, in any old place, in any old way, does not accrue those same benefits. So how we do it is important, is the fact that we are doing it if we hope to get those benefits. As we just said, an improved contraceptive does have promise. A real opportunity for making humane population control more economically viable is to maximize the amount of labor that's donated. On the one hand, that's very helpful, but on the other hand, if you think back to those graphs where most of the cost of these treatments was orange and only a little bit at the bottom was blue, if paying for trapping is what it takes to get significantly intense TNR done, it's actually well worth the investment. It's not a deal breaker. So if you have to pay 20% extra on top of your program to get from a situation where you're sterilizing 50% of your cats to 80%, that's actually very much worth it. So don't engage in false economy in that regard. And then finally, as I think we all know, the rate at which animals move in sets profound bounds on what we can accomplish in a given place. All right. So the potential to do good is highly dependent on what that influx rate is. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up with my personally favorite part of all of this, I think, and it's a little less applicable to the topic of this symposium, but I think I can tie it to it in a way that's reasonably compelling. What we've been doing, what all of us have been doing to one extent or another, is thinking about our starting point and our ending point and what it takes to get there. And regarding the comparison between our starting point and our ending point as sort of the gold standard of what we've accomplished. But there's a whole trajectory that happens between that has consequences from a humane perspective. On some management trajectories, more animals die or die prematurely. If we track what's happening in this virtual system, not pre and post, but cumulatively over that whole 10-year period, we can ask these questions. What's not only what gets us to the place that we want to go, but what pathway to that place is most beneficial given the mission that many of the people in the room have as their driving force. So we could at least start to ask this question. In ACC&D, we've called it various things. I don't think we've decided what we'll call it yet, but for the sake of the presentation, we'll just stick with cumulative demographics, which is a lot less emotionally compelling, but anyway, they're all up there. So for this exercise, we actually broadened the number of scenarios that we looked at, management scenarios. We looked at doing nothing. We looked at what we call light removal, which is removing animals from the landscape in a kind of a traditional catch and kill way, but at a relatively modest rate, so-called heavy removal. We looked at light and heavy culling. Culling is different from removal in that culling means you go out and remove animals from the landscape and then do nothing until they build back up to close to where they were and then start over, right? Whereas removal is more systematic over time. We looked at a light TNR, a TNR intensity that's sufficient to help individual cats but not to drive numbers down appreciably, a heavy TNR, and then we looked at a kind of an effective contraception scenario. And furthermore, we tracked these metrics. We tracked the number of kittens who were ever born under all of those different situations. We tracked the number who survived to adulthood. We tracked the number of premature deaths, which we defined as the number of kittens who did not survive to adulthood, plus the number of adults who were literally killed in a lethal management scenario. We did not track adults who may die prematurely under different management regimes, as was talked about being a possibility in the previous case, so we may be underestimating some of these dynamics, but this is a starting point. And we made some comparisons. Now, those different scenarios produce different outcomes as you'd expect. Doing nothing has, as you'd expect, no impact on population size over 10 years. Culling is notoriously going to fail to reduce population size because by definition, you knock the numbers down and then let them build back up to where they were and then knock them down. So it's going to just seesaw. We failed to put heavy culling here, but it's just going to do the same thing, but the dips are going to be deeper. Light TNR is going to have a modest effect on population size, light removal, on and on down the line. And here's where it starts to get interesting. Not in terms of the outcome at the end, but in terms of what happens between the start and the finish. So there's two sets of comparisons here, because there's not a way to visually get them all on one graph. So here what we're looking at is a no-action scenario, heavy culling. This is ineffective. This was light TNR, actually, and that's heavy TNR. There's good news and there's sobering news in these graphs. The good news is that if you do it TNR effectively, compared to doing nothing or doing culling, you have far, far, far fewer early kitten deaths. You have far, far, far fewer premature deaths. And, of course, consequently, since you're driving the numbers down, you have fewer adults who's ever lived on the landscape. That one's not as surprising. The more surprising one happens here, and there's a lesson in it, a good lesson and a cautionary lesson, I think. Here we're comparing light removal, heavy removal, light TNR, and heavy TNR. Now, again, light removal is sort of what animal control departments have done for years. They sort of go out there when somebody's complaining about a cat, they pick it up, they bring it to the shelter, probably gets euthanized. Effective TNR we've been talking about. That's a very encouraging comparison right there. Early kitten deaths, premature deaths. Where it gets interesting is that heavy removal, it's not something any of us morally support, but if you go out there and remove a whole bunch of cats from the landscape, compared to doing sort of fitful light TNR, you get what initially is probably the opposite of the intuitive effect. And it's because in heavy removal, you're knocking the number of cats down very early. Okay, and there's not as many reproducing. Whereas if you're doing TNR that's ineffective for population control, lots of kittens are being born, they're bumping up against their carrying capacity, kittens are dying prematurely. So the lessons here that I think this emphasizes, and we're going to ask more questions about it. Can you go back one? I think I might have skipped one there. No, I don't. The lesson here is that we have a lot of justification for saying that doing humane fertility control is not only beneficial for population management, but beneficial from a humane perspective over time. But it depends on us doing it sufficiently intensively and sufficiently well. There is a cost, in other words, for choosing to do our fertility control episodically and kind of in an uncoordinated fashion. And the lesson, the cost is not only in terms of our final outcome or failure to achieve it, but it means we're not preventing as many premature deaths as we potentially could if we applied it effectively. So I think that's what I'm trying to summarize here. Exactly. If we use our fertility control effectively, we get two benefits. We get a better outcome at the end, and we prevent a lot more potential suffering along the way, a lot more. If we use it ineffectively, it undeniably helps individual cats, but we lose the opportunity to not only get to where we would potentially like to go, but we're allowing a situation to persist where a lot more animals are dying early than they might otherwise. So I think with that said, just about right. So any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Their efforts are really geared towards maintaining a stable population, preferably a sterile population. Have you done any modeling which is geared towards that outcome?
Well, the no action outcome. This is somebody said it yesterday, that the way that we're after population use and population growth is kind of problematic. Doing nothing, in most cases, creates a stable population in the sense that the number of cats on the landscape is being governed by some carrying capacity that imposes limits on it. So it might bounce up and down below it. But it's, in one sense, stable. It might have a lot of turnover because of premature death and immigration, but it is stable. It's just actually more stable. Sorry? You needed the microphone. Thank you. Sorry. So stability is not a property of management. Stability can occur. I mean, natural systems are capable of regulating themselves and impose a form of stability as long as environmental conditions are stable. So I think the terminology needs to be different. So now if the question is that some people who do TNR are not seeking to drive numbers down, but just seeking to maintain them at a number that minimizes premature death, the goal there is to do enough sterility control that the reproductive rate matches the replacement rate. In other words, they're the same. There's not that, you've eliminated that excess reproduction, but no more. So you could tailor it that way, but it's sort of implicit in these models.
Yeah, I personally would think there's a difference between doing nothing and providing an environment which is more humane for preventing premature deaths, etc. So I don't know.
Well, certainly from the perspective of the life quality of the individuals who live there, there's absolutely no doubt about that. If it's being phrased in terms of stability, demographic stability, both of those situations are in a sense stable. Just the underlying dynamics that stability is maintained by are quite different.
Is that not only true if the, if you like, carrying capacity of the environment of the colony is up to maximum?
Mm-hmm.
If it's not up to maximum, then presumably the colony can increase until it reaches maximum.
Mm-hmm. So carrying capacity is not a fixed entity for all time. People have the capacity to change it up or down depending on what they do, and other circumstances do as well. Climate change could change carrying capacities over a period of years and decades in different places, as do human garbage disposal practices and probably the frequency of guns in households and all sorts of things. So people influence carrying capacity for sure. And they can choose to do it actively, or they can kind of do it unintentionally one way or the other.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Can you go back a slide to your chart thing there that you had with the different? Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So when you were talking about looking at the different scenarios, the one thing I was trying to compare it sort of what you were thinking versus what really happens out in the big wide trapping world. And much of what happens is there's removal and TNR happening at the same time. So there are kittens and friendly cats being removed, in some situations up to 67 in Massachusetts, 90% of the cats and kittens are being brought in and put up for adoption in shelters. So there's a big removal component. So that heavy removal line, regardless of what the outcome is, in our case it may be a positive outcome because there's an opportunity for placement there, shows the great impact with that. So there's this combo TNR removal that happens together. So your scenarios were sort of isolated. Right. You had removal only and TNR only. So it'd be great to see that as a combo. And then I think that those adult bars over there would be interesting to look at in communities where you have a very aggressive, free or low-cost spay-neuter program for owned cats. Because I think that those programs are what move the needle for the owned cat community, as well as really having a managed TNR program versus more of a return-to-field program. But I think that if we can overlayer a few factors, it might model a real-world environment a little bit better.
Yeah, these are kind of discrete points of reference. There's all sorts of intermediate points or combination points that aren't depicted on that graph, and there's no doubt that if a significant number of cats who go into the TNR stream are being put into the adoption stream, if that cost can be borne, that's a profoundly useful thing from not only from the endpoint perspective, but from this perspective as well, because that's a whole set of animals that are now basically getting their best possible outcomes in terms of veterinary care when they're sick, on and on down the line.
Yeah, I don't know a program that doesn't wear that combo hat. They're always removing kittens, so it's not an either or, it's both.
Yeah, and in a way, the ultimate context there is that, again, for a fecund animal like a cat, different for elephants, but for an animal like a cat, the way that nature regulates populations is wasteful of life. So that is not always completely intuitive, and it just drives home the point that when we start messing in a system like that, it pays to sort of think about how the system reacts at a more integrated way than just what we see right in front of us. And I think there's a lot of good news in there, but it emphasizes the importance of trying to do this as well as we can, not only at an individual care level, but at a population level. Yes?
Dr. Boone, you're a biologist, right? Why does the cat wars people, why do they say they accept the vacuum effect for coyotes, wolves, every other animal, but the minute we talk about the vacuum effect in cats, they do not accept that. They really do not. Why?
Well, I think there's an answer for them, although I don't know the particular arguments you're referring to. But a vacuum effect, which is called basically a density-dependent effect in ecology, it's not a property of what you do. It's a property of where your population density lies in relation to that carrying capacity. So if we were to go out into this population of 50 cats and take 25 of them home and get them adopted out, we've created what ecologists call niche space in that environment, and any cats that are wandering around will tend to fill that space up. They'll do it the same whether we've removed those 25% cats 25 cats to be adopted, or remove those 25 cats by euthanizing them, or remove those 25 cats by sterilizing enough of them so that the population goes down. So from the vacuum effect perspective, it's not a treatment-specific phenomenon. It's a population density phenomenon.
But why do we have to argue with them so much over that?
I would be glad to talk to you about that. That's something I and others in the room have worked on quite a lot, trying to bridge that gap. Katie in the back, Peter, Roger, there's several of us in here. So grab any of those folks or me and have that conversation. There's a whole lot going on that could be positive in that regard, I think, moving forward. But there's no doubt that the situation has become problematically polarized.
Okay, thank you.
So in all these models, you have a fixed carrying capacity, and inevitably we're very caring people and tend to do our TNR efforts and also bring a lot of food and other resources out there. Is it a linear relation that if you increased carrying capacity, you would just see this linearly change, or is it more exponential? Does that make sense?
I think in theory what you'd expect is that if you change a carrying capacity suddenly, the intrinsic population growth rate, which is an exponential curve in the classical sense, would be invoked, subject to whatever attenuation happens in the real world, because the real world's messier than theory. So if you could somehow double that or triple that or quadruple that suddenly, you would probably see that exponential growth rate starting to happen, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's a scary thing when you think about the whole totality of what we do around the whole issue is sometimes I think we forget about that impact, that nonlinear impact of changing carrying capacity.
As with many complex systems that are hard to manage, and there's lots of them out there, in theory, if you could manage, in the cat case, the fertility control and resources and abandonment and immigration simultaneously, that all of a sudden becomes a much easier nut to crack. Trying to move the system by just poking that one part of it becomes quite a lot harder. Anything else? I think go ahead. Does anybody who's got a schedule know if, I think it may be moving over to the other room time? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any of you guys who want to move over to the other room, just feel free to do so. But if anyone wants 8 minutes, if anyone wants to stick around and ask a question, I'm happy to do that.
For the light TNR versus heavy TNR, was 75% the magic number that popped it over to effective when you were running these models?
So I think we went to 75% because there's lots of published literature that suggests, well, no, we didn't. Let me back that up. We chose arbitrarily an intermediate level of population size reduction as sort of our standardized outcome so that we can compare ways of getting there in a fair way. And I think we just sort of arbitrarily chose a reduction of about 50%, and that sterilized 75, which is not keeping 75% of the population sterilized. It means remember 75% of the target animals every time step. And we've got a translation table that turns that into the mean sterilization rate over time. Right? And it does end up to be about 80% when you do that, as I recall. But there was an arbitrary element in choosing that particular gold standard for comparison. We could have chosen sterilize 80 or sterilize 90 or sterilize 60.
That would be really interesting to see it at 50, 60, 70. And
there actually is some of that sensitivity analysis in those 400 and some scenarios that were run, believe it or not. Okay, anybody else?
I'm still stuck on the one. In these models, do you assume that cats that are treated through TNR and vaccinated and their wounds taken care of and taken out of the reproductive pool live the same length of time as if they hadn't been treated?
I didn't catch the last, I'm sorry.
The sterilized cats live the same length of time as if they hadn't been.
Yes, there is none of that differential survival based on sterilization status that you guys have integrated into your stuff. That does not happen in this model.
Thanks.
Not that it just wasn't done at the time we were constructing it. No. All right. We'll see you across the hall. Thank you.